Texas Crossroads of North America by Jesús F. de la Teja. Ron Tyler, Nancy Beck, Chapter 3, Part 2. The Death and Rebirth of the Spanish East Texas. The new governor of Texas, Spanish-born Colonel Juan Maria Vichiancho, Baron de Ripardo, accompanied by his Mexican-born wife, Mariana Gomez de Parada Gallo y Villavicencio, arrived in San Antonio early in 1770, marking the beginning of a new chapter in Texas history. Technically, his command was Presidio Las Ades, but the pressing needs of reorganizing and strengthening defenses at Beja, not to mention the perils and inconveniences of taking his new wife to East Texas, led him to take up residence in the Casa Reales government building. He and the Baroness must have been greatly relieved when late in 1771, Viceroy Antonio Maria de Bucciarelli denied Ripardo's half-hearted request to transfer to Las Ades, with the admonition that because Nachitos was now Spanish hands, he should remain where he was. Ruby's inspection made clear the deplorable conditions at Las Ades, which, despite officially serving as the province's seat of government, was little more than a poverty-stricken appendage to Nachotes. Previous governors, who also served as Presidio commander, had exploited contraband trade with the French Louisiana and the labor of their subalterns with little thought but a quick exit from what seemed like the most remote and least inviting portion of New Spain. Life in Spanish Texas was hard at Las Ades. It was harsh. Women in frontier society. Although they were members of the elite, the Baron and his wife's arrival in Texas was an example of a common occurrence at the time. The migration of families to the frontier, the myth of a European male-only frontier, does not stand up close to scrutiny in the Texas case. La Salle had attempted to establish a well-rounded colony by bringing a number of French women along on his tragic expedition of 1685. The Spanish crown, always interested in establishing stable colonial communities, had encouraged married soldiers to move to Texas from the time of the Ramon and Alarcon expeditions of 1716 to 18. One of the viceroy's counselors commented that married soldiers were a double benefit, as they, quote, will be able to fill their presidios with the children that their wives bear them, unquote, and they would be less likely to make advances to the neophyte females and take advantage of them. The effort to bring the Canary Islanders to Texas had also been predicted on the migration of families rather than single individuals. Of the 56 Islanos who eventually made it to Bexar in 1731, only 4 were single adult males. Of course, frontier conditions made Texas a male-dominated society, and Spanish females were always in short supply. Women like the Baroness Ripardo, a high-born Criollo, were rare. Most Spanish women in Texas had been born on the frontier, and their Spanish status was often based on social convention rather than biological grounds. Beginning with the conquest of the 16th century, exclusively male undertakings, many men had found companionship in Indian women, and some took women of African descent as wives. Over the course of generations, if family circumstances improved, the children of such mixed couples might pass into the ranks of the Spanish. By the late 18th century, the term Spaniard was more recognition of social status than ethnic label, especially on the frontier in the case of Texas, although the evidence points to considerable ethnic mixing. Spaniards were reported to make up a majority of the population. The continued infusion of significant numbers of acculturated Indians and a smaller number of individuals of African descent into the Hispanic population kept the reported Indian population consistently at about 25% and the mixed blood population at about 20%. Aside from her relative wealth, the Baroness Riparda was fortunate in a number of respects. Her husband lived out his stay in Texas, whereas many other Tejanos could expect to be widowed once or twice if they did not die in childbirth in one of the period epidemics that swept through the province or during an Indian attack. The Baroness delivered 6 children during her husband's tenure in Texas, at least 2 of whom died in infancy. Her experience was not uncommon. Most women in Texas, indeed throughout in New Spain, would expect to lose half of their offspring in infancy from birth to 2 years. Although the Baroness did not have to worry about food or shelter despite her husband's repeated complaints about their quarters' poor state of repair, the overwhelming majority of her contemporaries faced a life of unremitting toil, with the exception of a few families that had one or more servants, sometimes a hired hand, sometimes a captured Apache or Comanche child, who was brought up in a household as a criada, literally reared as distinct from a hired servant or slave. Women worked long hours to maintain their households. The large number of widows meant that many women had to take on the role or sole provider for their families. As heads of households, they engaged in a variety of occupations outside the home, such as seamstresses, midwife, and shopkeeper. A few women acquired property through inheritance and marriage and became important ranchers and farmers in their communities. For some, economic reversals and lack of other opportunities prescribed a life of servitude or prostitution, an activity that seems to have been grudgingly accepted in colonial Texas. And of course, there was always danger of being captured during a raid, that thus becoming a commodity in the region's economy. To be either ransomed, enslaved, or married as a secondary wife, active public participation in the economic life of Texas required women to have legal rights that afforded them considerable protection and what was a man's world. Thus, the Baroness Riparda and all women, from the best positioned Spanish matriarch to the lowliest Indian maid, benefited from a legal system that recognized them as individuals. Women had the right to own to their own separate property, including those goods and real estate they acquired before marriage or that had been bequeathed to them. Moreover, after marriage, they were entitled to half the property of that husband and wife acquired while a couple. The right to defend one's property and honor required that women play a role in legal proceedings so they could initiate legal actions and give testimony. These rights extended even to slaves, who on a number of occasions successfully positioned to be removed from the homes of abusive masters. And as theirs was a Roman Catholic society, women could file for divorce from abusive runaway husbands, although neither party could remarry before the death of his or her former spouse. The first capital of Texas abandoned. Las Ideas, despite the Marquis de Ruby's dismissive assessment of East Texas and the Ripardi's dread of having to live there, was the second largest settlement in the province of Texas and the most ethnically diverse in 1770. Over 500 Spanish subjects lived among the remaining Aboriginal inhabitants, members of various Hasinai and Atakapan groups, and growing numbers of Louisiana's white and black. In fact, the Chpts, just across the border, was a thriving community that offered more regular contacts with the outside world for Spanish population of East Texas than Barajinos and Badeños, residents of La Bahia, had. The death warrant for the 50-year-old capital of the Provincia de los Tejos y Nuevos Filipinos had long since been signed. However, and it fell to the Baron Ripartia to execute it. In the process, he and the policymakers in Mexico City came to discover just how deep-rooted the local Tejanos' attachment was to their homes in the woods of East Texas. Ripartia arrived at Las Aires in June of 1773 with draconian orders. Not only was he to close the existing missions, but he was to see that the two presidios were destroyed and the entire Hispanic population of the area relocated to San Antonio. Resentment and resistance emerged on all sides. Some Aracenos, as the Las Aires area residents were known, fled to the Nachotes, and others into the isolated woods where they had cleared fields and built their cabins. The Hasinai groups in the vicinity took the withdrawal as evidence that the Spanish had allied with the Apaches and prepared to make war with them. After the governor failed to adequately reassure them, the refugees had to leave 2 families behind at Nacogdoches and a sign of goodwill toward the Indians. The overwhelming majority of the Aracena refugees arrived in Beck on September 26 to a less enthusiastic welcome. They were instructed to look for house lots and farmlands in the vicinity, but without disturbing the property of Bejanos or missions. This was impossible without moving so far away from the settlement that they would be exposed to Indian attack and lack of access to irrigation water. Some families did find places for themselves. After the sharecroppers at the missions hired hands for some of the better-off residents or in military service at the Presidio, at least half of the refugees, however, were determined to return to East Texas, and soon after their arrival, they petitioned for permission to establish a new settlement at the site of the former mission, Nostra Senora de los Seis, present-day San Agustin. The Aracenos petitioned had Governor's Ripardo's support. He was not only sympathetic to the plight of the dispossessed Aracenos, but their return to East Texas would buttress the Indian policy he favored, forming alliances with area Indians through trade. Of particular importance was establishing friendly relations with the Wichita groups that had moved into north-central Texas. The Wichitas seemed well disposed toward the Spaniards, but were actively trading with Louisiana. Ripartia believed that removing the Hispanic East Texas population would not solve the illegal Indian trade problem, but would only serve to undermine the authority and respect officials in San Antonio commanded among the Indians of the region. His opinions were not shared by the Oganar or Viceroy, both of whom wished to toe the line in regard to closing Texas off from Louisiana, prohibiting trade in firearms with the Indians, and sticking to Ruby's Presidio line of defense. Eventually, Ripardo's refusal to carry out instructions he regarded as counterproductive cost him his office. The Viceroy did not permit the Aracenos to settle so close to Louisiana, but did allow them to select an intermediate location. More than 120 families made the decision to move to a site at the Camino Real crossing on the Trinity River. While about 60 or 70 families remained behind in San Antonio, the new settlement, Nostra Senora del Pilar de Buchareli, required a government and protection. No presidio or army detachment had been authorized for Buchareli, so the governor organized a militia named Antonio Gil Yarbo, captain of the militia and Justicia Mayor, effectively making him lieutenant governor for the district. It is difficult to imagine anyone better suited to the job of running that was essentially a renegade settlement of smugglers and Indian traders. A native of Las Ares, Yarborough was schooled in various Indian languages and French, adept to contraband trade, and skilled in the arts of political survival. His rather loose interpretation of property rights had landed him in jail in New Orleans by order of Governor O'Corna in the late 1760s, when he was caught with horses alleged to have been stolen by Indians from various Texas settlements. An enemy of O'Corna was a friend of Riparda, and the Texas governor soon obtained Yarborough's release from jail. The two men saw eye to eye on a variety of issues: the need for continued Spanish presence in East Texas, the need for broad and sympathetic trade relations with the northern tribes, and the need to maintain commercial ties with the Nachutos. Indian-Spanish relations transformed. Under Yarborough's guidance, Spanish East Texas was reborn, even as the settlers were forced to abandon Bucareli, for the site of Mission Nacogdoches in early 1779 because of hostilities with the Comanches and flooding on the Trinity River. The settlement of Nacogdoches coincided with administrative changes both at the local and viceregal level. In the late 1778, Colonel Domingo Cabela y Robos, Governor Ripardo's replacement, arrived at Bexar, a career Army officer like his predecessor. The 53-year-old considerable experience in colonial matters, but none in frontier affairs. He had served in Cuba, displaying conspicuous valor during the English capture of Havana in the 7 Years' War. His gallantry earned him the governorship of Nicaragua, a position he held for almost 12 years before receiving the Texas post. Cabela must have wondered what he had done to deserve such a posting. Texas had such a bad reputation in New Spain that his cook, quote, came to believe that the Indians would eat him, for which reason he resigned from my service. And the same thing happened with my manservant and his secretary. Although I recognize that they did right, because this place is worse than Siberia, and Lapland, there were no cannibals in Texas, but Cabela's comments reflect the general perception of the Texas frontier as a savage land. With about 3,500 Spanish residents, including acculturated Indians, to tens of thousands of indigenous inhabitants, Spanish Texas remained very much de facto Indian country. By the time Cabello assumed office, the most of the Ruby's reform ideas was underway. The creation of an independent administrative and military jurisdiction for the northern frontier, the Comandancia General de los Provincias Internas, represented José de Galvez's attempt to make frontier government more responsive and efficient. The region, including the entire north of the Viceroyalty from Sonora and Sinaloa to the west, the Nuevo Santander and Texas to the east, would be administered by a commandant general, a military official holding both military and political authority, independent of the viceroy. On January 1st, 1777, Caballero Teodora de Croix became the first commandant general of the interior provinces. Croix was an experienced army officer who had served in various political capacities under his uncle, a former viceroy. He was acquainted with the situation on the northern frontier and in Texas, and did not agree with the policies of either the current viceroy or inspector general, O'Connor. He soon replaced O'Connor and began to carry out an inspection tour of his jurisdiction that included holding a war council at San Antonio de Bexar. As far as Texas was concerned, Croix agreed with Ripardia and Athanase de Mezeres make peace with the nations of the north and the Comanches, and make war on the Apaches. Athenes de Mesurius, a native of Paris and former French army officer and Indian trader, had served in the Nacogdoches beginning in the 1740s. After the Spanish takeover, Louisiana Governor Alejandro O'Reilly appointed de Mesurias, who readily accepted Spanish rule, lieutenant governor for the Nacogdoches district. De Mesurias quickly won over Governor Ripardia to his ideas on Indian relations, and Spanish maintained good relations on the frontier tribes. Not surprisingly, the war held by Croix at San Antonio in January 1778 placed blame for Texas Indian problems squarely on the shoulders of the Apaches, especially the Lipans, and called for all-out war against them. The nations of the North and the Comanches had not been hostile to Spanish interest until the Spanish had made peace overtures to the Apaches and built missions and a presidio for them. Even worse, because the Apaches refused to keep their word, Spanish Texas had ended up again at war against all these groups. The council also approved Ripardio's agreement with the nations of the North, negotiated through the de Mesurias. Although some have groundlessly regarded these treaties as deceitful, all the nations except the Comanches have scrupulously kept them. Only all-out war against the Apaches, combined with concerted diplomacy toward the Norteños and Comanches, could bring peace and prosperity to the province, and only Athenes de Mesurias had the necessary diplomatic skills to bring the province's Indians into an alliance against the Apaches. However, de Mesurias' declining health did not permit him to accept Commandant General Croix's offer of the Texas governorship. He died in San Antonio in November 1779, having made peace between the nations of the North and the Spanish, still advocating diplomacy toward the Comanches and war against the Apaches. Here's the picture and the title ship. The situation was not clear to Governor Caballo. However, on his arrival, he was confronted by Comanche raids on Bursaly and friendly visits from Lipan and other Apache chiefs. From the Caballo's brief survey of the situation, de Mesurias' instance that the Comanches were not the problem made little sense. Consequently, at first Caballo decided not to take sides in intertribal affairs. Rather, he focused on getting various tribal groups to accept Spanish sovereignty. For instance, in 1779, he made the Tonkawa leader El Macho medal chief. All three North American European powers gave large ornate medals to Indian headmen who they recognized as a tribe's or band's leader. The honor did not make the Tonkawa leader compliant. El Macho refused to gather his Tonkawas in a village or to stop dealing with Apaches as Governor Cabela desired. In fact, in 1782, he organized a fair trade in his territory. The territory of the former Ranchero Grande between the Brazos and Trinity Rivers for the Apaches and his tribe, the Hasinais, Carancas, and Atacabas, although their fare was broken up by the Wichitas and Comanches, he saw the danger to themselves of a revitalized Lipan Apache nation. El Macho's independence so enraged Cabello that he arranged for the chief's assassination 2 years later at La Bahia. In time, Cabello came around to the general consensus that Norteños and Comanches presented an opportunity for peace, while Apaches represented menace. Having accepted that, the Lipan Apaches, who had relocated in the region between San Antonio and La Bahia from the San Antonio River Valley southward, posed and ongoing threat. Cabela was ready to negotiate with the Comanches. Likewise, for Wichita's and Comanches, the smallpox epidemics of 1781, a devastating drought, and trade disruptions with Louisiana favored reaching some agreement with Texas Spaniards. In 1785, the new policy of gift giving and diplomacy and making use of experienced translators. Cabello and the Comanches and Wichitas came to terms. The agreements effectively recognized Comanche and Wichita independent to the north and west of San Antonio. Trade and gift replacing raiding. Scholars debate what the regular gifts from the Spaniards might have meant to the Comanches. Reciprocal hospitality for the good treatments Spaniards received in Comanche camps, wealth redistribution as a measure of kinship or alliance, or a form of tribute from the Spaniards. From the Spanish perspective, the gift-giving referring by some scholars as peace by purchase might be seen as a way of attaching the favored Indians to Spanish trade goods and services, since only in the Spanish settlements did the artisans exist to repair the firearms and acquire the gunpowder that now become part of the Spanish-Indian exchanges. The Spanish crown could claim, fanciful as it might be, that the Indian peoples of Texas were its vassals. Until well after the turn of the century, only the various Apache tribes and occasional groups of young independent warriors troubled Spanish Texas. It was the longest period of relative peace that the province enjoyed until the end of the Indian Wars in late 1870s. Sunset for the missions. Reform and change market the religious realm as well as the military political spheres of life in late 18th century Texas. The mission system, backbone of Spanish policy on the frontier, had given way to a more secular and economic perspective on Spanish Indian affairs. In Texas, the Eastern missions had failed to produce tangible results among Hazaños in over 50 years of existence. In the mid-century experiments at San Saba and El Cañon, with the Lipans, San Xavier with the Ranchero Grande, and El Orcazac with the Acocasas, had been disastrous. Even the active missions at Bejar and La Bahia faced new challenges that would prove insurmountable in the long run. The mission system in decline. For all intents and purposes, by the early 1770s, the only active missions in Texas were located at Bexar and La Bahia. These missions had made such remarkable progress in physical terms through the early 1770s that there was considerable animosity between Hispanic settlers and the friars over livestock, land, and water rights. The missions controlled some of the best grazing land in San Antonio River Basin, having established their ranching operations long before the civilian population had begun to venture into the countryside. The Bexar missions had built extensive and sophisticated acacia system. By the 1770s, the mission compounds included large stones, churches, workshops, granaries, and living quarters. In effect, the missions were independent communities that competed with civilian settlements for both resources and markets. Despite all these physical advantages, the missions had always faced one important hurdle in becoming the ideal Christian Spanish communities. The friars wanted them to be maintaining adequate Indian populations. The Ranchero Grande, Cohicatans, the Carancawas, on whom the Franciscans of Bexar and La Bahia depended to populate their missions, had never been numerous peoples to begin with. Life at the missions often proved detrimental to the health of these hunter-gatherers. Dietary changes combined with different hygiene regimens weakened immune systems already under assault from a variety of pathogens alien to the region. Periodic epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other Old World diseases took a great toll on all residents of Texas, but particularly on the Indians. In addition, the mission's efforts to impose European values, particularly in the areas of division of labor, work routines, and sexual relations, contributed to the Indians' frequent flight. In time, the mission system faced a population crisis that the Spaniards were unable to overcome. Although the Bexar missions had averaged more than 200 neophytes each during the 1750s and 1760s, by the mid 1770s, there were fewer than 200 at La Bahia. There had been a large number of Indians at Espiritu Santo, and a new station, Nuestra Senora del Rosario, had been constructed for local groups in the 1750s. Neither establishment contained more than 50 families by the 1770s. A Carranca attack against Rosario in 1778 had led to the mission's abandonment by all its Indian residents. The collapse or flight of the neophyte populations forced friars to undertake forays into the countryside to round up runaway neophytes or recruit new ones. But these coercive exercises were increasingly unproductive. The Coahuiltecans were becoming scarce. Coastal Indian groups, which proved particularly well insulated from Spanish encroachment, found that they could incorporate the missions into their annual cycle of seasonal migration without having to accept unwanted aspects of Spanish civilization. The Lipan and other Apaches might flirt with the missions, but as groups they proved unwilling to abandon their independent way of life, even in the face of increasing pressures from the Norteño and Comanche enemies. Missions were never able to attract the most populous tribes of Texas Indians, the Comanches and Wichitas of northern and western Texas. As a result, missions came to depend on a small core of acculturated Indians and increasingly large numbers of non-Indian residents to maintain operations. Presidio missions complexes had operated fairly amicably with the community in East Texas and at La Bahia, because for the most part in East Texas the missions never developed substantial resources, and at La Bahia the civilian community remained small. Such was not the case at Bejar. However, from the time of the Canary Islanders' arrival, there had been considerable tension between the civilian and mission communities. There was competition over land, water, cattle, and the sale of agricultural products to the Presidio market. The settlers attempted to gain access to the labor of neophytes, and the friar felt that the settlers were corrupting their Indians. These circumstances combined to increase pressure on the Texas mission to scale down their operations. The first missions were too close were the remaining East Texas stations, those among the Hasinais as far east as Las Aderes, and the one for the Acoquisas on the lower Trinity River. These closures released the Zacatecas College friars for duty at the four Bexar missions operated by the Cotero College, which in 1777 abandoned Texas to concentrate on its more successful operations in Sonora and Arizona. The pressure mounted with the arrival of the Commandant General Croix in 1778. Croix listened to the complaints of the settlers and missionaries about each other. He certainly understood the problems, and as a member of the new breed of more secular and regalist officials that the Spanish Bourbons were employing to modernize the empire, his actions favored settler and government interests. To modernize the empire, as far as the province's livestock was concerned, he strictly enforced property rights of all parties, including the crown. As for the dispute over resources between Mission Valero and the townspeople of San Antonio, he ordered the suppression of the mission. Each Indian family would gain agricultural land and a house lot from the distribution of mission property, after which the Adayas, settlers, and other civilians would have access to the remaining farmland and lots. It was not until the early 1790s that both of the decisions were implemented. However, as lawsuits and reprieves wound their way through the imperial bureaucracy, secularization begins. When the president of the Texas Franciscans, Fray Jose Francisco Lopez, sat down to make his report on the state of the missions in 1789, there was little positive to say. 9 friars attended to the needs of the province, 1 at each of the 6 operating mission communities, another 2 at the Nacogdoches settlement, and 1 as a substitute wherever he was needed. Only San Jose and Espiritu Santo counted more than 100 Indian residents, most of whom imperfect Spanish, even after a long time in residence. In fact, the missions had become multi-ethnic communities. The Indians, as Fray Lopez wrote about Valero, having married mulattoes and mestizos, the physical state of the missions varied widely in quality and state of repair, with Valero and the abandoned Rosario in the worst shape, and Espiritu Santo and San Jose in good condition. Various construction projects had to be abandoned for lack of Indian labor, including larger churches at Valero, the main part of today's Alamo Chapel, and at Capistrano. Although Texas missionaries enterprise seemed to have some life left in the coastal environs of La Bahia, conditions at Bexar were such that the Zacatas College could no longer justify operating 5 stations there, with the college considering Fray Manuel Julio de Silva's ambitious proposals for converting all of the coastal Indians from Nuevo Santander to the Mississippi. The college's resources would have to be redistributed. Although the plan ultimately founded and only the Capano Bay Mission, Nuestra Senora del Refugio, was built, the project set in motion the suppression process for the Texas missions. Governor Manuel Munoz received a new order for the suppression of San Antonio de Valero in February 1793. Suppression or secularization was the final stage in the life cycle of a mission and marked the successful transition of a new Christian community to parish status. Secularization was not a mark of failure, therefore, but of success for the religious, as it marked the formation of a permanent Catholic community. The goods and property of the mission were divided among the Indians, who had farmed communally and, except for a limited amount of self-governance, followed the directives of the friars. They were now considered adult Christians and full citizens in Spanish colonial society. Leftover land and water could be used by the community to attract additional settlers. In this case, the Adasinos and other worthy San Antonio families were held in reserve for the children of current families in the spring of 1793. Therefore, San Antonio de Valero became a separate civilian community, although as far as region was concerned, it became part of the San Fernando parish. On April 10, 1794, a year to the day from when the secularization of Mission Valero began, Commandant General Pedro Nava issued a decree for the secularization of all missions more than 10 years old in the provincias internas. The order had 2 principal objectives. First, it was meant to address the complaints of ranchers, farmers, and mine owners throughout the region that the mission only served the interest of the friars, who had sole access to Indian labor. Suppression of missions would free up valuable and scarce water and land for expanding civilian population. Second, a reduction in the number of missions would mean a real savings to the crown. which had to provide each friar with an annual stipend. In addition, with the reduction in the cost of guards, escorts, and incidental expenses, the savings to the royal treasury would be substantial. In Texas, the decree meant closure, not only of the remaining 4 Bexar stations, but also of Espiritu Santo and Rosario. Typical of the confused and contradictory enlightened reform effort of the Spanish Bourbons, the decree gave the mission Indians their freedom, granting them all the rights and privileges enjoyed by gentle de raison, rational people, that is, competent adults, while at the same time ordering governors to appoint local officials as justicas, magistrates, to oversee the activities and property of Indians so that they would not be victimized or become lazy and debauched. The Indians were no longer under the supervision of the missionaries, who were now limited to looking after their spiritual warfare. Yet they were not completely independent either. Governor Munoz was skeptical about whether secularization would be successful, particularly in the case of the La Bahia missions, where populations consisted of Indians only recently brought under instruction. Consequently, he decided to start with the 4 Bexar missions, where he carried out the distribution of property during summer of 1794. Beginning at Espada and moving northward to Capistrano, San Jose, and Concepcion, he distributed land and chattels to the resident Indians, with most of the land set aside for future use. Concerned that there were still a few Indians under instruction, he divided responsibly for the mission residents between the justicas, who had authority over those Indians deemed civilized enough to participate in the new order, and the friars who remained in charge of the neophytes. Nevertheless, it seems clear that the 4 missions continued much as they had in the past. The friars continued to exert considerable influence over the activities of the Indian residents. The residents continued to elect a governor and alcalde annually. The farming and animal husbandry that went on was mostly on a subsistence basis. Every once in a while, a small group of Indians would appear at the gates of the mission compounds and come in for instruction. The one significant change was the steady growth in the number of settlers who occupied farm and ranch land in the vicinity of each mission. By the turn of the century, Concepcion, Capistrano, and Espada had all had a majority of non-Indian residents. Having completed his work in Bexar, Governor Munoz traveled to La Bahia early in the fall of 1794 to inspect the missions there. He found too few of the Indians at Espiritu Santo and Rosario ready for civilized lives, and so petitioned for a reprieve. It took until May 1797 for the Commandant General to decide to grant the 2 La Bahia missions a 5-year deferment from the secularization decree. In that mission, Nuestra Senora del Refugio, which had first been founded in 1793 as part of Fray Silvia's project for the conversion of coastal Indians, had found permanent home at the site of present-day Refugio. At the end of the 18th century, the 3 La Bahia missions represented the only fully authorized Franciscan missions in the province. Here is the map of the location. The birth of the Texas Cattle Kingdom. By the time secularization of San Antonio missions began in 1793, All of the Franciscan establishments in the San Antonio River Basin had long ceased to play an important role in the province's economy. In fact, because they controlled valuable irrigable farmland near Bexar and vast expanses of grazing land as far away as the coast, the missions stood in the way of progress. Although they had been instrumental in establishing the first successful livestock operations in Texas, by the 1780s, the missions could no longer train or employ enough Indian herders to maintain themselves or challenge the increasingly aggressive civilian ranchers who were encroaching on ranch land. The first Texas ranch, 1720 to 1780. Stock raising had been an important economic activity from the very beginning in Spanish Texas. The early expeditions introduced herds of horses and cattle, and sometimes sheep and goats. In 1720, the Marquis de Aguayo brought thousands of heads of stock, not only to supply his army, but also to help seed the presidios and missions he left. In the wake of his expedition, of one of the wealthiest ranchers in northern New Spain, he might have been using his visit to Texas to scout out the country for the potential expansion of the haciendas. In the end, neither he nor of any other great stockmen, sheep and cattlemen known as haciendos established operations as far north as Texas. A few of the early military settlers managed to build up small herds. Mateo Perez, an early soldier who died in 1748, left over 200 cattle and 50 horses in his will. Early soldiers of Barnaby Carbajal and Francisco Hernandez had herds large enough by the 1730s that they obtained grants of grazing land, but their operations were limited by the threat of Indian tax and their own meager economic means. In fact, it was the very limitations of livestock raising that influenced use of the term rancho, originally a humble mixed farming property. Rather than hacienda, for Texas livestock properties, it was missions, particularly those at La Barria and Bexar, the first developed herds and flocks large enough to require construction of ranch compounds. At first, the mission herders, specially trained neophytes with civilians or soldiers acting as overseers, maintained their animal in the vicinity of the missions. As the herds grew, however, it became necessary to move them farther away, except for Mission San Jose, which headquartered in operations south of Bexar. In the Atascosa River, the other San Antonio missions established their ranches southeast of the settlement. East of the ranches, between San Antonio and Guadalupe rivers, Mission Espiritu Santo claimed land in what are today Victoria, Goliad, DeWitt, Gonzales, and Carnes counties. Of all the missions ranches established in Texas, the one that best illustrates the conflicts that rose between the missions, the civilians, and the government is Rancho de los Cabros, Goat Ranch. The livestock enterprise of Mission San Francisco de la Espada, and today a state historical park. By the 1740s, the southernmost of the Bexar missions had established its pastures along the south bank of the San Antonio River, opposite of present-day Floresville. The ranch was more than a goat ranch. However, as flocks of sheep and herds of cattle and horses also required the attention of a growing number of neophyte ranch hands, making these Indians among the earliest Texas cowboys. In time, the operation grew to comprise an impressive complex of structures that were the envy of the area's civilian ranchers from the extensive archaeological remains. We know that red sandstone walls enclosed a large compound that contained a sturdy stone chapel, dwellings for the ranch families, and utility buildings and corrals. For defensive purposes, two torrones, towers, served as bastions at the northwest and southeast corners of the compound. Although its stone walls could protect the residents of Rancho de las Cabras, nothing could protect the open range claimed by the mission from the assaults of both settlers and Indians. Following the 1749 Treaty of the Apaches, a number of families with livestock interest moved into the countryside in force, claiming what pastures and watering places the missions had not reserved for themselves, and conflict soon arose. The missionaries charged that the so-called ranchers were moving next to the mission ranches. In order to efficiently despoil the neophytes of their livestock, they argued that all the cattle in the countryside, branded and unbranded, belonged to their Indians because the missions had brought the first cattle to the area. The ranchers responded to their parents and grandparents who had brought cattle and horses into the province. As one San Antonio alcalde reported to a Mexico City judge hearing a complaint from the missionaries, "This is so distant province could be no less populous than that of Saltillo, because its land is pleasing, fertile, with abundance place to take water, and fields and plains sufficient to receive and maintain large populations. But as these waters and lands are only diverted in order for the missions to make ranches, the non-holding vecinos do not benefit, nor does His Majesty, and that his dominions are not settled." While the ownership issue slowly made its way through the courts and various layers of bureaucracy, Indian warfare had created a crisis situation. By 1772, only Ignacio de la Peña's ranch and Rancho de las Cabras had withstood the Indian assaults that had resulted in the destruction of abandonment of all other Cabras had with Indian of all other operation in the area. Sorry about that. Construction of military post Vuelta de Santa Cruz del Chipola, halfway between Bexar and La Bahia on Chipola Creek, was ineffective. The fort was conceived by the Marquis de Ruby as a way to repopulate the area by offering immediate protection against Indian assault. Governor Cabello, never happy with the location of the understaffed and overextended fort, eventually prevailed upon the commandant general to abandon and destroy it in 1782. Governor Ripardo had attempted to mediate the complaints with both camps, only to find himself the subject of complaints. When Commandant General Croix arrived in Bexar in January 1778 to hold his war council, he was forced to listen to days of grievances from governor, missionaries, and ranchers alike. Although the position of friars and stockmen were similar, the unbranded stock belonged to them. The governor had a larger agenda. Ripardo pointed out to Croix that the uncontrolled and indiscriminate slaughter and export of cattle from the province was bound to lead to its extinction. Although here was a public source of wealth being exploited by people who paid no direct taxes to the crown, the commandant general responded by issuing what can be considered Texas' first environmental regulation. His ordinance of January 11, 1778 declared all unbranded stock property of the crown, required licensing of all cattle exports from Texas, established a tax on all unbranded stock captured either for export or slaughter, and imposed heavy fines for the unlicensed slaughter of unbranded cattle. Though this measure, Croix hoped to raise revenue from a province that had always been a drain on the royal coffers, protect the cattle population, and the end of the ownership dispute. The Mesteña Unbranded Stock Fund, as the livestock tax was commonly known, proved extremely controversial and was challenged by all stock raisers in the province efforts by succeeding governors to control the consumption of breeding cows, a particularly detrimental practice, only to serve to increase animosities. Only in 1795 did one of Croix's successors, Pedro de Nava, reaffirm the measure for giving back taxes owed but granting all legitimate stockmen just 1 year to gather mestino cattle and horses before taxes were assessed again. Governmental regulations putting missions on a par with ranchers in regard to unbranded stock contributed greatly to the demise of Texas mission system. Continued Indian depredations and an inability to recruit neophytes took their toll on Rancho de los Cabras, which, although it still had 26 residents, when Croix and Fray Morifi passed through on their way to La Bahia early in 1778, was already in decline. The murder of 6 to 8 Espada herdsmen by raiding Indians in 1780 to 81 was almost insurmountable loss, especially when hiring civilian cowboys cost 1 peso a day, the highest wage for any skilled work in colonial Texas. When Governor Cabello ordered a branding roundup in 1780, Rancho de los Cabros was unable to participate. In fact, Valero was the only Bejar mission able to field roundup and branding crew. The rest of the participants were private ranchers. Triumph of the civilian ranchers, 1780 to 1800. By the time Governor Cabela managed to negotiate a general peace with the Comanches and Norteños in 1785, the end of the mission ranchers was in sight. Cabello's successor, Rafael Martinez Pachicho, who was sympathetic to the plight of all Texas stockmen, crafted a series of roundup agreements in 1787 that allowed the mission and ranchers to round up as many animals as they could within assigned territories. Fray Pedro Norino, representing Espada, was optimistic that somehow he could field a crew and revive the fortunes of Rancho de los Cabros. Such was not the case, however. When Martinez Pachacho issued his final report of the roundups, neither Espada nor any of the other Bexar missions had managed to capture a single animal. Only Mission Espiritu Santo had branded cattle, 1,418 head compared to 6,231 cattle and 183 horses branded by the ranchers. Without neophyte vaqueros cowboys to maintain the mission's ranching interest, Espada's missionaries, along with the friars at other missions, had long since begun to make compromises with encroaching stockmen, which led to the eventual transfer of Rancho de los Cabros to civilian ownership. Ignacio Cavillo had occupied the land in the vicinity of Rancho de los Cabros as early as 1774. He had gained the mission's approval by 1778. Within 3 years, he was the recognized owner of Rancho Paso de los Magros. Similarly, Juan Barrio, a native Coahuila and tithe collector for Texas, moved into the area during the 1780s. He operated a ranch he called Santa Gertrudis, possibly only renting the land so he could pasture the stock he collected as diezmero, tithe collector. Soon after the secularization, the two men moved to complete their takeover of Rancho de los Cabros, Cavilla taking the upper portion of the mission ranch, including the site of the headquarters compound, and Barria taking the lower portion, which came to be called Los Cabros Viejos. This process was repeated at other San Antonio missions. The return of the mission grazing lands to the royal domain that accompanied suppression was the ultimate victory for the Vicino stockmen of Bixar, who had vied with the missions for control of this valuable asset for more than half a century. Ranchers won in two ways. First, they acquired large numbers of unbranded cattle that roamed the prairies of south central Texas. Second, in the 3 decades following secularization, civilian stockmen moved into the former mission ranches and claimed them for themselves. By the turn of the century, ranching had become the principal economic activity of Texas, despite adverse climatic conditions, severe financial constraints, persistence though greatly diminished, Indian raids on herds, and continued reliance on natural reproduction of the semi-wild stock on the open range. At Bexar, where there were 14 recognized ranch owners in 1791, there were 35 in 1810. Nacogdoches too saw a boom in ranching, particularly in horse breeding, during the 1790s, as the final collapse of the area's cattle population left a number of clearings open for the taking. By 1810, there were more than 20 registered ranch owners in East Texas, including a number of Anglo and French Americans who had made their way into the area as authorized Indian traders, government agents, and squatters. This will be the end of Chapter 3, Part 2. Thank you.